Thanks very much. It's a real honor to be in this distinguished panel. And I have to say that there's very little to disagree with what His Excellency just said, but maybe I could illustrate it a little bit with the broader context of Africa as a whole. First, going back to the growth that Schengen was describing, I mean, it's true that Africa has been through a period of relatively rapid economic growth, starting about the late 1990s, early 2000s, about the time of the IFPRI initiative. And it's important to keep in mind that this was not just due to high commodity prices. I mean, every time you look through it, because we've had periods of high commodity prices in the past without this long period of sustained growth. And the other thing is that this growth is shared among non-commodity exporters as well, countries like Ethiopia and Rwanda and so on. So what is going on here? And there's very clear evidence that the macroeconomic policy environment has improved across the board. Just to give you one factoid, median inflation in Africa in the mid-2000s was half of what it was in the mid-1990s. And I think the other interesting thing, this is a lesson or a hint to the oil exporters, because one of the other problems is that we've had oil exporters who have not done very well with their oil money, shall we say. But when the price of oil was about $130 a barrel in 2007, Nigeria, Angola, and Gabon, the three major oil exporters, used as a reference price $65 a barrel. So they were saving that amount. Now, and this improvement in macroeconomic policies and the growth that came with it created a virtuous cycle where there was increased political support for further reforms, as the President was describing earlier as well. And then the global crisis hit in 2008-9, and several people, myself included, maybe my friend Mwangi as well, we panicked because suddenly this virtuous cycle had broken. Through no fault of the Africans, I might add, right? That now the growth payoffs to reforms has suddenly disappeared because of some decisions taken in New York and London. And we thought that the political support for these reforms would also evaporate. And particularly if you look at the kind of policies that the developed countries were following, Africans were tightening their fiscal deficits, and the developed countries were widening their fiscal deficits. And Africans were in the process of privatizing banks or deregulating banks, and the developed countries were nationalizing banks. The interesting thing is, this didn't happen. We were wrong. That actually most African countries continue to follow prudent economic policies during the crisis, because they saw that the payoffs to doing so were much higher than the payoffs to blowing the budget at that time, because they'd learned that experience before, including, I mean, it's very interesting that Ghana for other reasons had a fiscal deficit of 14% of GDP, I think, in 2008. So that when the crisis hit, where some of the countries that had sufficient fiscal space were running slight surpluses, Ghana actually embarked on a program of reducing their fiscal deficit during a global recession. And it paid off because these countries now rebounded. And growth has rebounded in 1 year, which is the fastest turnaround of any crisis. And now growth is about 5% for this year, 2012, and expected to be even higher next year. Now, that said, I think Schengen mentioned this in the beginning. There's no question that growth is good, and there's been significant poverty reduction and significant improvements in some human development indicators, but we haven't seen this transformation. It is true that most African countries are still dependent on commodity exports for national GNP, and the diversification that you normally see hasn't occurred. But let me qualify one thing that Schengen said, because you said something like there's been urbanization without transformation, without industrialization. Well, another interesting factoid is that most low-income countries in Africa, I should qualify, most low-income countries for which we have reliable data, which is a smaller set, what we observe is that they've been generating formal sector private wage jobs at a faster rate than GDP growth, right? Ghana, Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, wherever we have, whenever we have the data that we believe, we look at it and see that growth of private formal sector jobs has been 7-8% a year, and GDP growth has been about 6 or 7% a year. Now the trouble is that's from such a small base that it cannot absorb the large number of young people that are entering the labor force every year. So, the estimate is about 10 million young people enter the labor force every year. So it's still the case that, as the President mentioned earlier, that 70 to 80% of the labor force is in the informal sector, either as smallholder farmers or household enterprises, literally mom and pop shops, or pop and son shops, I guess, working at very low productivity jobs. So the transformation agenda, I would say, and by the way, I should just add that this, because of the number of young people born 15, 20 years ago, this isn't going to change, right? That's a force that's coming that you can't do anything about, right? Which means that even if you accelerate job creation in the formal sector, you do everything possible, and if GDP growth grows at Ghanaian rates, even with that, if you project out for 10 years, it's still the case that 60 to 70% of the labor force will be in the informal sector. That's the unpleasant arithmetic of this. So the challenge for us is not. I mean, we should still start creating those jobs in the formal sector and do it as much as we can. But that still ignores the big part of the problem, which is this large informal sector. So the challenge for us is increasing the productivity of that informal sector, be it in agriculture, be it in these household enterprises. Now that takes us to the question: how do you do that? Because that's a huge problem. But I said the first thing is to get policymakers to think about that problem. Rather, they mostly see the unemployed graduates, unemployed university graduates in the capital city. In fact, even Ghana has a unemployed graduates association. Yeah. And they can. We all know from the Arab Spring. Yeah, they can create a lot of trouble for you. They can throw you out of office, right? So you should pay attention to them. But remember, that's still the top 1% of the population. The fact that they have university degrees puts them in the 1%, right? And what about the other 80%? That is, half of whom have not even finished primary school, right? It's a little better for the flow. The new entrants is about 30% who haven't finished primary school. But that's the bulk of the population. They don't get a lot of attention because they're not as noisy as these unemployed graduates. But our job has to be with them. Now let me just end by saying that in looking at what we can do for the informal sector, I think that is the big challenge. We should all be working on it. There are, again, two broad areas where the two big areas that people usually talk about. One is infrastructure, right? Africa has this huge infrastructure deficit, and only 25% have access to electricity, and so on and so forth. And the other is skills, human skills. But if you dig a little bit deeper in both of those, the infrastructure and the skills, you realize the problem is not money. It's not even hardware, I would say. It's the software. It's the leadership, if you like. It's the policy and regulatory framework. Take transport, for instance. Everyone says that one of the reasons Africa is not competitive in manufactured goods is because of the high transport costs. Shipping goods made in the landlocked countries out to the ports. And if you've driven on some of these roads, you sort of get a sense of what those transport costs are like, and so on. Well, we did a study of the 4 main transport corridors in Africa that ship goods from the landlocked countries to the ports. And what we found, actually, I was quite shocked, The pure vehicle operating costs along these 4 transport corridors are no higher than in France. Right? But transport prices for African goods are the highest in the world. Now, the difference between transport prices and vehicle operating costs are the profit margins accruing to the trucking companies. And these margins are of the order of 100%. Then you say, well, how is it that you can sustain 100% profit margins? Well, it turns out there are regulations in the books in almost all of these countries that prohibit entry into the trucking industry. Because back in 1960, they thought that trucking was a natural monopoly and needed to be protected. Right? But now you've created a lobby, these guys earning 100% profit rates, who will resist every single attempt at deregulating the trucking industry. And it doesn't help that in one country, the president's brother actually owns the trucking company. So there's no hope there. But just to show that this is not just sort of academic hair splitting, one country, Rwanda, did deregulate. And transport prices fell 75% in real terms. So these are the problems. These are the infrastructure problems facing the continent. And I need your help if we're going to get, because these are deep political problems, and we need to figure out. Now, let me just end, and I'm sure my friend Mwangi will elaborate on this, and some of it is his work. On the human development, on the skills side, again, no question, very low skills, and so on. But the problem is not access to education anymore. Primary education basically is 90%, I don't know what Ghana's what, 90-odd% primary enrollment rates and so on, right? The problem is it's not clear these kids are learning anything, right? In Tanzania, there was an NGO that did a survey that surveyed 7th grade students. So these kids have already been to 7 years of primary school. 20% of them couldn't read a single sentence in Kiswahili, in their own language. 30% of them couldn't do a 2-digit subtraction problem. And 50% of them couldn't read a word of English. And English is the medium of instruction for secondary school. So basically, these kids, having finished primary school, don't have any chance of going to secondary school. And you say, well, what's going on here? These kids are in school all day. Well, there's somebody else who isn't, and that's the teacher. Right? There's this work that Mwangi and some colleagues, and I guess I'm associated with it too, been doing these service delivery surveys, show that in Tanzania, which is the country I was just referring to, 23% of the time the teacher is not there. In fact, when the teacher is there, they're in class teaching for about almost 2 hours a day out of an 8-hour day. And if you think this is a problem in education, let's look at health, right? Which I think is much more serious. You still have absentee rates of doctors in primary clinics of the order of 25-30%. But it's worse than that, because we have huge leakages in public funds. The extreme version is Chad, where of the amount of money, non-wage public spending that was meant for primary clinics, the percentage that reached the clinic was 1%. 99% leaked out, right? And then the other thing is, again, one of these service delivery surveys that really shocked me was in Tanzania, again, and in Senegal. The public doctors in these primary clinics spend the total amount of time they spend per day seeing patients is 29 minutes. Right? This is the thing. I keep asking, they're always talking about the shortage of doctors and the brain drain, and they're all sort of showing up here at GW Hospital and things like that. This is a shortage of patients. 29 minutes a day. So there's a deep governance problem here. And it's a political problem because these guys are very powerful. Medical unions, they can throw a president out of power if he tries to reform them. And that's why we're stuck with this situation where the doctors get away with huge rents, the politicians get reelected, and the poor people suffer. Now, to end on a positive note, let me just say that I think my sense is that this is changing. And it's changing for a couple of reasons. Actually, can you show that African success stories? Mwangi brought this book of ours called Yes, Africa Can. You look at some of these 26 success stories in Africa, and they all have a common theme, which is, as the president was saying, you know, the public, various parts of the public get together and put constraints on these government failures so that you can't do it. You know, in Rwanda, they introduced a bonus scheme for doctors to get them to show up, where you get paid 50 cents for every child immunized, or $1 for every pregnant mother who's examined. And the health indicators just shot up. And they did this as a randomized control trial. This will make the IFPRI people happy, right? So that they could actually associate these with the treatment group as opposed to the control group. And the other is the power of information, which we've seen with technology as well, where when you publish some of this information, you get these absentee rates out to the public. That begins to put some pressure on the local government. And then you begin to see some transformation. And I mean, the classic example was the Uganda Public Expenditure Tracking Survey, where they did a similar thing to the Chad example that I mentioned, where they looked at how much money meant for primary schools arrived at the school, and it was 13%. The Ugandan government actually did something interesting. They published that number in the newspaper, and they put it on the radio and the billboards. And then people started, when they found out that number, they started demanding to know how much was coming to their district. So the newspaper had to publish the amount of money coming to the district. When they found out how much money was coming to the district, they started asking the school principal, why is it, now I know how much money you're getting, why is it that my kid says there's no chalk in the classroom and no textbooks and no furniture and things like that? So the school then had to publish the budget of the school on the schoolroom door. To this day, you see the budget on there. And that number went from 13% to 90%. Right? The power of information in driving public policy. So let me just say that I'm optimistic, but I think there's some deep governance problems that we have to solve if we're going to get to structural transformation. Thank you.
Thank you, Shanta. Listening to your talk, just roller coaster. Rapid economic growth. Sorry. I just rode a roller coaster. So very high, right? Very optimistic picture about overall economic growth. Then some of the deep challenges Africa is facing. Then he also touched on some of the successful stories towards the end. So anyway, thank you, Shanta. Now, Wangi.